They say some bloodlines were never meant to mix, that certain names should have been erased from the family Bible before they ever touched paper, but in a small town tucked deep in the American South, where gossip dies quicker than truth, a man was born whose very existence defied nature itself. His name was Henry, though history refuses to remember it. What little remains of his story exists in fragments, a coroner's note, a faded photograph, and the whispers of a town that wanted to forget. They called him the most inbred man alive, a title no one asked for, and no one should bear. Yet behind that label was a lineage so tangled, so rotten from within, it became its own prison. Henry didn't know at first who he really was. He only knew that his mother, who was also his grandmother, raised him on a property that never saw strangers. They said the family had old ways, but those ways were older than decency, older than law. It began generations earlier, with one man's obsession to keep his blood pure, his fortune untouched by outsiders. What followed was a closed circle of births and burials, each generation sicker than the last, until Henry came into the world like a living curse. His face carried the signatures of that history, two close-set eyes, a jaw that never fully formed, hands that trembled when he tried to hold anything fragile. But the real deformity was hidden deeper, the confusion of love and ownership, of mother and wife, of sin and tradition. When officials finally uncovered the truth, they tried to bury it under paperwork. Undetermined parentage, they wrote. But those who saw the birth certificate, those who read the family Bible with the same two names written again and again, knew better. This wasn't a tragedy of circumstance. It was the deliberate creation of a monster. Not a monster by choice, but by design. And yet, what if Henry never knew? What if, to him, love was simply what he was taught, tender, familiar, and wrong all at once? When he looked into his mother's eyes, did he see his creator or his companion? Did he know the difference? The story of Henry is not just about one man, it's about the part of America that prefers its horrors homegrown and hidden. They say the sickness began with William Carter, the patriarch, a man who wore religion like armor but used it to cage his own blood. In the late 1800s, William inherited two things, a decaying farm and a fear of the outside world. He preached that outsiders were liars, that the only pure soul was one born from clean hands, meaning hands of his own kin. It began subtly, marriages between cousins, then between uncles and nieces. By the time the First World War began, the Carter line had already sealed its fate. The children stopped leaving, the neighbors stopped asking questions. The property itself became a tomb of silence. Locals remember seeing figures watching from the tree line, pale faces that seemed to fade when you looked twice. The family stopped attending church. Their shutters stayed closed even in summer. When the county tried to collect taxes, William's son chased the man off with a shotgun, shouting, "God keeps the books here." Inside the house, the rules were absolute. No outsiders, no talking to strangers, no marrying anyone not of the blood. Over time, the logic twisted itself into something unrecognizable. Love became duty, birth became commandment, and when daughters came of age, they were told their husbands were chosen by God. But God, in the Carter house, looked a lot like their own father. By the time Henry was born, the bloodline had folded in on itself 4 times. He entered the world small, quiet, and shaking, as if his body already knew what it carried. His mother, Clara, was barely 30, but she looked 50. Years of malnutrition, isolation, and childbirth had carved deep hollows beneath her eyes. Her mother, Henry's grandmother, had been her husband too. The papers never said it plainly, but the midwife who delivered Henry never forgot the way Clara flinched when asked who the father was. She whispered something about keeping the nay, and then nothing more. After that birth, something in the Carter house changed. They stopped inviting the midwife. They started burying their own dead behind the barn. The land became overgrown, the fences collapsing inward like ribs. Locals said you could hear cries at night, soft, confused, not quite human. And yet the law never came, because in that part of America, family business was sacred. even when it reeked of sin. Henry grew up without knowing what the outside world looked like. The Carter property was his entire universe, an acre of dying soil, a crumbling farmhouse, and a silence that felt alive. His mother, Clara, told him stories about angels who lived beyond the trees, but who would burn you if you ever tried to find them. He believed her. Why wouldn't he? She was everything he knew, his comfort, his jailer, his only human touch. There were no school books, no friends, no birthdays. The days bled together, marked only by the rhythm of chores and the strange tenderness Clara offered when no one else was watching. Sometimes she would brush his hair and hum an old hymn her own mother had taught her. The melody carried a strange weight, like grief pressed into sound. Henry didn't understand the words, but he could feel them sink into his bones. As he grew older, the lines began to blur. Clara started calling him "my sweet husband" when she thought no one could hear. When he asked what she meant, she would just smile and say, "You're the only one who truly belongs to me." At first, he thought it was just affection, a mother's strange way of loving too much. But one night he saw her crying in front of the mirror, whispering apologies to a reflection she could barely face. There was a photograph Henry found once tucked inside the family Bible. It showed a young woman who looked just like his mother, but she was standing beside an older man, the same face as Henry's own. The caption on the back read, "William and Clara, 1909. Henry was born in 1934. That realization shattered something in him. For the first time, he began to sense that his life wasn't simply strange, it was wrong. The air in the house felt thicker after that, the walls closer. Clara must have seen the suspicion in his eyes because her tone changed. She became distant, watchful. At night, Henry could hear her pacing in the hallway, whispering prayers not meant for anyone living. When he turned 17, she told him the truth, or her version of it. She said God had chosen their family for a special purpose, to keep their blood free from corruption. That outsiders brought evil, sickness, and lies. "We are all one flesh," she said, pressing her hand against his chest, "and you will carry that promise forward." It was then that Henry realized he wasn't being raised to escape. He was being raised to continue. The turning point came on a winter night in 1952 when the last of the old Carters died in his sleep. His name was Ezra, Henry's grandfather, though in truth that title barely meant anything in a house where every name folded into another. Ezra was the final link to the first generation of sin, and when he died, Clara told Henry something that made his stomach twist. She said the house now belonged to him, and so did she. It was the night the family Bible changed hands. Clara brought it to the table, its leather warped from years of handling. The names inside repeated over and over, William, Clara, Ezra, Mary, like a prayer gone wrong. Then she took a pen, dipped it in ink, and wrote, "Henry Carter, head of house." Beneath it, she left a blank space. "You'll know what name goes here soon enough," she said softly. Henry didn't understand, or maybe he didn't want to, but something in her eyes told him the truth before her words did. She wasn't talking about inheritance, she was talking about continuation. For the next few weeks, Clara grew ill, fevers, tremors, hallucinations. The isolation had caught up with her. Henry tried to care for her, but every act of kindness felt contaminated, touched by something unspeakable. She would reach for his hand in the dark, whispering his name like a prayer. He felt both love and terror. She was his mother, and yet, the way she looked at him had changed. Then came the night she didn't wake. Henry found her in her bed, her body still warm, her face calm, as if she had finally found peace. But beside her was something he couldn't ignore. A note, written in her shaking hand. It said only 3 words, "Forgive me, son." The sheriff's report later claimed she died of pneumonia. But when the coroner opened the family Bible, he found something strange. The blank space Clara had left beneath Henry's name. Someone had filled it in after her dear decease. The ink was fresh, It said, Clara Carter, wife. The authorities didn't investigate further. They closed the file, stamped it natural causes, and buried her beside the others behind the barn. The town whispered, of course, but only quietly. They said Henry had lost his mind, that he talked to her grave every night, calling her darling instead of mother. And by spring, he started referring to himself as we. By the mid-1950s, the Carter property had become a place locals avoided even in daylight. The house seemed to rot from within, the windows clouded with grime, the roof sagging like the back of something dying. Henry, now 22, rarely left the porch. When people passed by on the dirt road, they swore they could see him standing in the window, still, pale, watching, always watching. He talked to himself, or rather to her. Those who ventured close enough claimed they could hear his voice through the cracked boards, having one-sided conversations, laughing softly, answering questions that weren't there. "Yes, Mama," he'd say. "I remember. Sometimes. I'll do it right this time, Clara." Her name on his tongue sounded both tender and broken, like a wound being kissed. The sheriff made one last visit after a neighbor complained of a smell coming from the property. He found Henry in the parlor, sitting in a chair with the family Bible open on his lap. His clothes were filthy, his eyes glassy and unfocused. The sheriff asked where his mother was buried, and Henry just smiled. "She's not gone," he said. "She's home." When the sheriff went upstairs, he found what was left of her. Clara's body had been dug up and returned to her bed, dressed in her wedding gown, yellowed with age. The room was cold, the air thick with rot and perfume. Henry had set the table downstairs with 2 plates, 2 glasses, and a single candle that never seemed to burn out. That was the last day anyone in town saw him alive. The sheriff left that night and returned with men from the county, but the house was empty, the bedsheets were torn, the Bible was gone, and only one phrase was carved into the table where the candle had burned itself out. "We are whole now." The house sat abandoned for years after that. Teenagers dared each other to step inside, but few ever made it past the porch. Some said that they saw a man's shadow moving in the upper window, though the floor had collapsed decades earlier. Others claimed to hear 2 voices whispering prayers from the overgrown graveyard behind the barn. No one ever found Henry's body. The coroner's record was never updated. The Carter name was quietly erased from county ledgers. It was as if the bloodline had decided to vanish, like a stain the earth finally swallowed. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have run, or stayed to finish what they started? Years passed, and the Carter place sank deeper into legend. Children whispered about it at bus stops. Parents warned their kids never to wander past the oak tree that marked its edge. The county eventually fenced it off, citing unsafe conditions, but no one was fooled. Everyone knew it wasn't the structure that was dangerous, it was the story. In the 1970s, a pair of university researchers came through town. They were studying the effects of long-term genetic isolation, tracing cases across rural America. When they heard the name Carter, the locals went quiet. Still, one old man pointed them toward the abandoned property and muttered, "You'll find your study waiting for you there." They thought he was joking. When they reached the house, they found it half swallowed by vines, but the inside looked untouched, as if time had decided to stop out of respect or fear. The table was still set for 2. The Bible was gone, but photographs were scattered across the floor, generations of the same faces repeating themselves like reflections in a broken mirror. In every one, the eyes were identical, the same weary gaze, the same slight tilt of the head. The researchers spent hours cataloging what they found. They discovered a box in the cellar filled with letters written in a child's hand, unsigned, but addressed to Mama. Most of them were prayers, others were promises. The final letter was dated 1956 and read, "When I wake up, we'll be together again, just like you said." The report they filed never made it to publication. The university sealed it under ethical review. Too disturbing, they said, too speculative. But one of the researchers, years later, would tell a journalist that the Carters represented the endpoint of obsession, the human family reduced to its own echo, and then he added something else quietly. We found bones under the floorboards, 2 sets, one large, one small. The DNA came back identical. After that, no one dared return. Nature reclaimed the house, erasing it piece by piece. The last remnants of the Carter name sank beneath the soil they had refused to leave. But if you visit that part of the South today, and you stand by the fence at dusk, you might hear it still, the faint hum of a hymn carried on the wind. 2 voices, almost in unison, whispering the words that built their prison. We are one flesh. We are one forever. By the 1990s, the Carter legend had slipped into the realm of rural folklore, one of those stories people tell to scare themselves, to remind each other that monsters don't just live in cities, they grow quietly in the corners of family trees. Local papers ran pieces now and then, ghosts of the Carter farm, incest and isolation in the Old South, but each retelling softened the horror, turning Henry into a myth, Clara into a curse. No one wanted to admit they'd been real. Until a storm hit the county in 1997. It uprooted trees, tore down the old fence, and exposed what lay beneath. A contractor working cleanup found something near the old barn, wooden boards laid in a perfect rectangle like a coffin without a name. Beneath them were remains, bones so fragile they collapsed when touched. At first, they thought it was an animal, then they saw the skull. What unsettled the workers most wasn't the find itself, but what lay with it. A smaller skeleton, curled beside the first. Both sets of bones had been carefully arranged, facing each other, fingers intertwined. And nearby, wrapped in a strip of rotted linen, was a book, the family Bible. The county sheriff, new blood, young enough to doubt the town's old stories, took it as evidence. Most of the writing had faded, but one final entry at the back was still legible. Different handwriting, neater, controlled. It read, Henry Carter, reunited, no date, no signature. The bones were sent to the state lab. The results never made it to public record, but someone leaked part of the coroner's summary to a local journalist years later. It said the 2 bodies were genetically indistinguishable, mother and son, perfectly matched, like reflections, like twins. The town tried to move on. The story became a warning passed through generations. Don't keep secrets, don't marry your blood, don't build walls around your love. Yet even now, the Carter land remains untouched. Every attempt to rebuild or sell the property ends the same way. Workers quit, machines break, blueprints vanish. It's as if the soil itself refuses to forget what was done there. Some nights travelers claim to see a lantern glow moving through the trees, a man's voice humming an old church hymn, low and mournful. They say if you listen long enough, another voice joins in, fainter, softer, harmonizing from beneath the earth. By the early 2000s, the Carter name had vanished from every public record. No descendants, no surviving deeds, no trace of the bloodline that once ruled its own patch of wilderness. But sometimes, erasure is louder than memory. Local historians started digging, obsessed with the question of how an entire family could disappear so completely. One of them, a librarian named Ruth Maddox, found something strange in a state archive box mislabeled Census Corrections 1930s. Inside was a single page from an original census ledger. Most of the entries were routine, farmers, shopkeepers, children, but next to the Carter name, the handwriting changed. The enumerator had written, household closed, bloodline private. The word private had been underlined 3 times. Below it, someone had scrawled a note in pencil, keep sealed per county request. Ruth requested access to the sealed files. Weeks later, she received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a faded photograph of the Carter family taken around 1910, Clara as a girl, William standing behind her, his hand resting too tightly on her shoulder, and next to them, a boy who looked disturbingly like Henry, though he wouldn't be born for another 20 years. That photo haunted her. She said later in interviews that the resemblance wasn't just uncanny, it was impossible. As if time itself had been looping within that house, trapping each generation in the same faces, the same sins. The cycle never truly broke, it just changed names. Ruth disappeared 2 months after her discovery. Her car was found abandoned off a service road near the old Carter property, the keys still in the ignition. Inside, police found her notebook, open to a single line she'd written in red ink. They kept it in the blood, even after death. The case remains unsolved. Her family refused to speak publicly, but one of her colleagues, who has later claimed that Ruth had been receiving phone calls before she vanished, always late at night, always the same voice, a man whispering her name, followed by 2 words, "Come home." After that, the archive sealed the Carter files permanently. Even journalists can't access them. Officially, it's to protect the integrity of local records. Unofficially, everyone knows it's because whatever happened on that property didn't stop with Henry. The land may have swallowed the bodies, but not the blood. In the decade that followed, the Carter story twisted into something larger than itself, part cautionary tale, part ghost story, part mirror of the country that birthed it. Podcasts dissected it. Online forums argued over photographs and family trees. Some said the Carters were just one example among many, forgotten experiments in rural isolation, unacknowledged pockets of human collapse. Others insisted it was all myth. But myths don't leave DNA reports sealed by state order. A documentary crew went out there in 2011, hoping to film what was left. They never finished the project. The footage that survived, barely a few minutes, showed their car pulling up to the foundation where the house had once stood. You can hear the cameraman whisper, "It smells like rain and rust." Then the lens turns, just for a moment, toward the tree line. There's movement, a pale shape, not human, not animal, something that stands, then sinks back into the dark. The lead producer quit the industry weeks later, said he'd dreamed of a woman singing an old hymn in his house every night, always from another room. His wife confirmed it, said he'd wake up with dirt under his fingernails, muttering, "She's calling me home." You see, the Carter story isn't just about bloodlines or madness. It's about what happens when a family builds walls so high that they start echoing their own voices back at themselves, generation after generation, each one hearing the same words. "We are chosen, we are pure, we are one." Those words became gospel, then they became law, then they became curse. Some say if you visit the site today, your phone dies within minutes, batteries drain, signals vanish. Locals claim it's magnetic interference from old iron in the soil, but those who've walked the property say it feels more like the air itself doesn't want you there. They describe the same sensation, a weight pressing on the chest, a whisper too faint to locate. And yet, people still go. Curiosity is its own kind of inheritance. We reach for horror the same way the Carters reached for each other, knowing it will destroy us, but unable to stop, because maybe, somewhere deep down, every family has a story they pray never sees daylight. And so it circles back to where it began. One family, one house, one idea of purity that turned into a tomb. You can trace the Carters like a shadow through American history if you know what to look for. The old censuses with names crossed out, the tax lots that remain mysteriously unclaimed, the churches that burned their records instead of answering questions. Every state has one of these families, whispered about but never written down, the kind that turn religion into law and law into silence. Henry and Clara were just the last link of a chain that had been tightening for a century, and when it finally snapped, the echo never stopped. That's the real horror, not the blood or the bones, but the repetition, the way isolation feeds on itself until the mind mistakes the familiar for the sacred. What began as fear of outsiders became a devotion to self, and what started as devotion became desire. There's something profoundly American about that. The myth of purity, the obsession with legacy, the refusal to let the past die even when it's rotted through. The Carters weren't an anomaly, they were a mirror a grotesque reflection of the same hunger that built towns, churches, and dynasties, the need to keep control, to keep what's yours, no matter the cost. When you think about Henry now, don't think of a monster. Think of a boy who was never given another language for love, a man who thought his mother's touch was the world's only truth. Think of a house so quiet that two voices learned to sound like one. There's a legend that if you stand at the ruins of the Carter place at midnight, the air goes still and you can hear a man whispering from beneath the ground, "Forgive me, Mama." And then a woman's voice answers, "We are forgiven." Maybe it's wind. Maybe it's just the way grief lingers. Or maybe it's the earth remembering what it was forced to hold, because the soil never lies. It keeps what we bury. So if you ever find yourself driving through the back roads of the South and see a sagging fence, a field that feels too quiet, remember the Carters. Remember how quickly love can turn to possession, how silence can turn into worship, and how some family trees are better left unspoken.